I thank the gentleman. We now get to what it might end up being last and least, myself. Number of questions. Ambassador Shea, you, and all of you are very qualified, but you're the most recently qualified when it comes to the actions of trade and what I would call coercion. And I think you alluded, both you and Mr. Bush alluded to this earlier. The techniques that are regularly used to help negotiate lower prices include part of TRIPS, do they not? In other words, if you, quote, deny a drug, a country is allowed to ignore the patent and make the drug because it's been denied. Isn't that a basic principle that you deal with?
I didn't deal with that extensively at the WTO, but I think you're right, sir.
And under that TRIPS enforcement, Canada has used that in order to set a price that they will pay for a drug with the threat that they will make a generic if they don't get that product. That's been going on for decades. It's one of the reasons that brand drugs are slightly cheaper in Canada than they are here. Well, generic drugs turn out to be more expensive. So I'm going to go back to this specific waiver. Isn't the threat of this waiver, or the use of this waiver in the sense of offering it, and the threat of offering it in the future, doesn't it inherently adversely affect the normal negotiations on licensing of companies' technology to around the world, not just in the developing world, but even between the European and the U.S.?
I think that's accurate. It does, as my colleagues have said, it dampens the desire for investment in these products or potential products. But if the threat is out there that I'm going to use the waiver against you, that can have a damaging effect as well.
Now, going back to alternatives to ever doing this again, and I bring this out for a reason, because it's always good to say, if the challenge, and Mr. Gresser, I'm going to probably put this to you, if in fact in that emergency we had recognized that we wanted no one to die for lack of the availability of this drug, weren't there a number of other tools available to the Trump and then to the Biden administration, including using our War Powers Type Act to mandate the creation of additional facilities or the repurposing of additional facilities to make additional drugs if there weren't sufficient amount? Aren't those tools that are available from the U.S. around the world? And they were used, for example, on ventilators during the administration. Aren't those tools that could have been used in lieu of this? Because you've supported the idea of the initial waiver.
I guess what I would say is that the response to COVID pandemic was quite successful. That the idea within a couple of years you would, from a standing start, have a safe and effective vaccine. You would produce it at a level able to serve the entire world. You would have logistics and providers able to deliver it to the patients. That's quite an impressive achievement, I believe.
So when we look at the model going forward, the use of this waiver again, until or unless other forms that do not deny the intellectual property return or respect, wouldn't those be better to push for either in statute or at least in practice by future administrations?
I think governments do need to reserve some right to take emergency actions in circumstances that they can't foresee. It is probable the next pandemic will be slightly different than this one. We don't know quite what will be necessary there. So I'd hesitate to say we should never do X or Y, but I think your point is a good one.
Well, and why don't we just say that the next pandemic is much worse. It's a new form of smallpox that vaccine doesn't work for, and it has a 70% morbidity, far worse than COVID did. Let's just say that hit tomorrow. Mr. Massey brought up a point, and I'm going to use it because it was extremely good. He likened this to a eminent domain, a taking of an asset by an entity that needs it. When it comes to eminent domain, have we ever seen eminent domain, even in a time of war or emergency, not lead to a reimbursement for the value of that taking?
I do not know nearly enough about eminent domain's history to answer that question.
Okay, but you are aware that even our Constitution calls that a taking, not even in time of war, not be without compensation.
Sure, yes. I guess what I would say in a circumstance like the one you're describing, I think the U.S. government and other governments and businesses would put all the money they needed into developing a treatment as soon as possible and would clear up whatever messes later.
So one of the things that's missing, and I'll go back to our ambassador who is, and I saw you over there at the last administration running in and out so fast you couldn't get a second word into a lot of people. So I know how hard you worked in a number of areas. But as we're looking at global trade negotiations, isn't the TRIPS waiver, even if it continues to exist, doesn't it lack that fair recognition that some compensation for that taking should have been considered? The taking for purposes of people not dying, I think on the dais would be undeniable. But the question of compensation, how would you deal with that if you were, again, the trade representative's chief go-to guy to go out there and do the work?
I wouldn't have gone for the waiver because it was a solution in search of a problem. But I understand your point. I mean, there's compensation envisioned, as Professor Bush pointed out, with respect to the compulsory licensing regime in TRIPS. So I would be saying if we're going to go down this route, the inventors, the innovators need to receive some sort of compensation.
And because I'm last, I apologize. I'm going to go a little over. Mr. Bush, I'm going to ask you the closing question. Because 5 to 7% on a drug that is a blockbuster might in fact get you fully compensated, but on a great many drugs, including orphan drugs, including drugs that are, as many of the new drugs are, I don't want to call them boutique, but they're refined for a specific cancer, refined for a much smaller group. 5 to 7% likely is never going to make you whole. And many of these countries rely on, oh, well, you were made whole in your parent country, in Europe or the United States, and thus shifting the make you whole back to the original inventor. Should we, in fact, as a matter of global policy, be trying to reform the system so that it not unfairly shift the responsibility, if you will, in a way in which they knowingly could pay more but choose not to simply because they can use compulsory licensing at an amount that they determine rather than anything close to a fair market return?
Notice how I said that it was Indian courts delivering a 5 to 7% royalty. In other words, the generic provider probably lowballed relative to the 5 to 7%, and the two sides ended up in court. So that doesn't bode well. But Mr. Chairman, to your question, my biggest fear is that if you do something like that, then we will have proponents of a waiver of whatever mechanism you come up with. So if you do hold hearings on that, I'm happy and ready to testify.
Well, I can assure you that in addition to courts and intellectual property, this committee, from the Chairman Jordan on down, does believe that we need to protect the fair return of, to those who create intellectual property, and that continues to be attacked by those who believe that intellectual property only matters if it's theirs. And with that, I see no further individuals. With that, I yield to the ranking member for a final question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Professor Bush, you did mention your discomfort with the compulsory license as being the mechanism through which payment was determined. What other mechanism would you recommend?
My concern isn't about the payment per se. My concern is that we gravitated to one of many mechanisms that might have produced an outcome more favorable. That, in other words, I do not see the compulsory license as the go-to instrument for achieving lower prices. There are other things, many of which are in the control of the developing countries themselves and could be put into effect overnight. The idea that we sprang to this idea of a compulsory license as really the only game in town, largely because of the experience with the AIDS crisis, was just wrong. And so my frustration isn't necessarily about the 5 to 7% or how that's determined. It's that we shouldn't have been looking at compulsory licenses first.
Thank you. Mr. Gresser, do you agree or disagree?
I guess I would say I agree. We shouldn't look at compulsory licenses first, but we should also recognize we don't know what the next crisis is going to be. We don't really know what the best response to it would be. So I don't think we should disavow any particular response in advance, but we should be, as I think the WTO members have in the past, able to recognize when we have a real emergency and to limit whatever we do to things that are specifically necessary or seem to be necessary at the moment, rather than extending it to a range of other topics and technologies.
Thank you. And Mr. Shea and Mr. Saddam, I assume you both agree.
Yeah, I do. I think it was interesting with the waiver that IP was the only. It came up very quickly, and it was assumed that it was in the way. But it wasn't. So it was the only part of this process in terms of solving the COVID crisis that didn't have to be proven it needed to be changed. Everybody just said, well, IP is going to be a problem. You brought up the War Powers Act. If you know that you can't manufacture something, then you say, I can't manufacture it. Let me use a different power to do that. But with IP, it just was de rigueur that this is going to be a problem before it was even shown that it was a problem. And I would hope next time we would try to prove that this is actually in the way of getting things that, cure people, that stop people from dying, that if it's a real problem, then address it then. Don't address it in the beginning.
Thank you. Thank you.
I'm going to close, not with a full statement, but just with a reminder that, Mr. Bush, you did aptly say that it seems to make no sense to waive what is effectively the rights of the intellectual property that would have led to a royalty or a product incorporating that royalty, while a country chooses to continue to have tariffs or taxes that artificially run up the cost of the medicine to their own people. So I certainly think, although that's not within the jurisdiction of this committee, it's good for us to note that in the future, or even in the near future, if there's an attempt to have a further waiver, this subcommittee and this full committee will quickly ask you to opine again in person. So I want to thank you. As I said in the beginning, if you want to revise and extend, you can. And of course,